Today, I'm going to show you how to make and mix grays so that you can have a rose garden that never fades. Let's get started. Joe Mackenzie here. I've been asked about the roses that I've been painting and specifically about the grays. And what I've been trying to do is simplify a rose, use as few strokes as possible, and to be able to calculate my grays so that the most vivid part of the rose is the most intense part. By vivid, I mean bright hue. If you look in the middle of the rose, similar to the photograph, where those petals all come together, it becomes darker. This is not in direct sunlight. This is a northern light, so it's indirect sunlight. But all the supporting colors are grays. Now, but what's important to know here is when, except for the real intense part of the rose, that where I kept it quite vibrant, everything else in the rose is almost the same value. It's very hard to see the value difference between, say, between this spot and this spot. Even when you blur your eyes, the overall object, except for where it gets dark in the middle, is almost one value. And that's a real challenge, which is very different from, say, painting something like this, a peach, because there are such strong differentiations in the colors of the object. And so this is all painted, with very bright hues. I would say the only gray would be maybe what I call the peach's belly button. And then around the peach, what I did was manipulate, for example, where it gets red here, I tilted this background to be a little bit green. So I'm using the complement to set it off. Here where it becomes more yellow, I'm using purple, which is the complement of that color again, to make it a stronger, that contrast makes the color of the object stronger. Here where the peach gets orange, I put some blue, again, complementary colors, and will make that pop. And down here where it's violet, there's more of a yellow. So everything that I'm doing when I'm using color, I'm doing around this object, but I'm making calculated decisions about that. And that's the exact same thing that I'm doing with this rose, but it's a much subtler way of doing it. So when we're talking about temperature, for example, let's see, when we're talking about temperature, I take some Naples yellow and some cerulean blue and a little bit of rose. And now I'm going to place that, I'm going to make a mark, which is this is the paper I want to use. Hope you can see this. I'll bring it over a little bit more. That is definitely a gray. You can see how gray that is. Now, my challenge is that I know I want to have some darker grays, darker relative to the overall rose, but I'm taking that gray that I just mixed and I'm adding more red to it because I don't want my grays to be gray. I want them to be an actual color. See how that went from being gray to being a red? So what I'm doing is, and this is a relatively warm red. Let's say the temperature on the rose gets a little bit darker. Then I'm going to need to lean toward, let's see, I'm taking Naples yellow, again putting a little bit of rose in it. And in order to make it tip further, and remember Naples yellow, the rose, and I'm putting in a little bit of cobalt blue. If I do that, that's the full spectrum. I've got a red, a yellow, and a blue going on, and those together are going to gray down. So let's see what happens now. Wow, it's almost exactly the same. So I think in the end I decided that that was going to be my cool gray. Except at some point I know that I added a little bit more blue to it and did use this as a cool gray. But I don't know if you can see this. If I bring it up closer, yeah, that's a cooler gray. See the difference between that, which is a gray, and this, which becomes, although gray, somewhat violet. So what I'm trying to do, like I said, is to put as much pigment in my gray as I can, deciding first, so I'm deciding which are my cold or cool grays, which are my warm grays, and then how can I make them still have some pigment in them. So now this would be a warm gray. I take Naples yellow again and a little bit of rose and add some orange and maybe even a little bit of yellow. The reason for going into oranges and yellows is because I know that I want this to be warm. All right, let's see what that looks like. There we go. So you can see if I was to stay in the gray range, I'm not going to have any color. So I cover that up. You see how each one of these still is a color. This is a somewhat pink. This is somewhat pink. They're almost the same. This becomes a violet. This is a peach. So what I'm doing is I'm playing with the complementary colors and also combining all three of my my basic colors in this case for painting this painting are Naples yellow. There's a Naples yellow, a permanent rose. There's a permanent rose, and some kind of blue. I've used cerulean blue quite a bit, and maybe I used cobalt blue a little bit as well. But when you combine these three together, they will come together and make a gray. My goal is to mix these so that instead of being gray, they end up being a variation of grayed down colors, but colors that I can read as actual colors. If I manage to do that successfully, then if I keep this one spot on the rose where it goes into the center very, very vibrant, where'd my photograph go? I don't know where the photograph went. I'll pick up a different rose instead. I think that's a different rose. But the same effect, you know, when you go in where those petals come together is the most vivid. If I make that the most vivid by using a very strong rose with maybe some red in it, and then everything else that supports it gets grayed down, but I cancel out whenever I can, I get rid of gray, because I ask myself throughout the painting, is that gray? And if the answer is yes, then I say, well, what can I do to it to make it into a pigment? What can I do that will make it turn into a color that I can name, either a red, a blue, or a yellow? And then I ask myself, is it warm or is it cool? Because on, let's see, on this side, mostly on this side of the rose, it tended to be a little bit cooler, but the variations are very, very subtle. So I hope that that gives a little bit of an explanation for what I'm doing here. And you can see some of the colors that I mixed for the rose I just did. See how warm they are? They're mostly kind of almost in the orange range. That's where most of that rose ended up. So in this rose that I just did, this is the dark. And normally, you know, if I'm painting a painting, that would not be my dark. Normally, if I'm painting a painting, you know, I want the full spectrum. I'll go into something as dark as purple. But in this case, the rose is such a subtle form. In order to get it not to be gray, and also not to be white, you know, that sort of, whatever that peachy color is, then I have to paint it with a variety of grays, determining the value of those grays and the temperature of those grays. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of explanation. But I would say for the most part, this painting was painted with these three colors. When I went into the background for some contrast, I think I put some ultramarine blue in. But anytime I'm dealing with the background of a painting, you know, I don't bring anything new to the table. You know, staying consistent with colors I've used so far. This is Future Joe, because I didn't want to finish the video right here because I didn't show you the actual painting of the rose, which I'm going to show in about 1 second. It's going to be speeded up to 20 times as fast as I usually paint. And I'm painting with a size 16 flat brush, occasionally using a 20, but for the most part using a 16. The piece of paper itself is only an 8x8 piece of paper, and the paper is cold press, Arches paper. So there you can see where I'm planning on putting those vivid colors. I want to get those in first. And I don't use any masking fluid or whiteout. what I do instead is I put a little bit of Naples yellow as placeholders for me. Even though my sign off is keep the whites of your paper white, I do leave some of the whites of the paper white. But if you look at the photograph, because this rose was not in direct sunlight, most of the sunlight that hits this rose is indirect. So there's almost no real true white the way you would see if I photographed this in regular sunlight. And there's a reason for doing that. You know, the challenge that I'm doing is I want to be painting objects that are almost one value altogether. I've gotten pretty good at finding value. Now I want to see, can I find the value, can I find the shifts in an object that's basically all the same color? And in order to make those shifts, then what I have to do is think about temperature. I have to think about warm and cold. If I do that correctly, then I will create forms and ultimately mass. So that's what I'm trying to do. You know, no one's making me do this. This is my own little project. I'm very self-directed that way. And now I went back and reinforced those vivid parts, which you can see. I think I do something in the background as well. Yeah, brighten that up a little bit. Now remember, brighten is not the same as making lighter. You know, in watercolor, you can't make things lighter. You know, once that's happened, you know, you can't get the paper back. So remember to keep the whites of your paper white, your paints wet, mass for value, mix for color. Please join my YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.